The dust settled around Willa Zimmerman's black mourning dress as she stood beside her second husband's grave, and the whispers started before the preacher even finished his prayer. She was 23 years old and already twice widowed, and the good people of Jerome, Arizona, had made up their minds about what that meant. The year was 1882, and in a mining town where copper veins ran deep through the mountains and superstition ran deeper through the hearts of men, Willa had become something worse than unlucky. She had become cursed. Her first husband, Thomas, had died in a mining accident 6 months after their wedding. A cave-in that took 3 men, but the town only seemed to remember that one of them had been married to Willa. She had mourned him properly, worn black for a full year, and tried to rebuild her life running the small bakery her mother had left her. Then Samuel came along, a merchant with kind eyes and steady hands, and for 8 months she had dared to believe that happiness might find her again. Until the fever took him last month, swift and merciless, leaving her alone once more. Now the townspeople crossed the street when they saw her coming. Mothers pulled their sons away when she walked past. And the men who had once tipped their hats and smiled now looked at her with a mixture of fear and pity that made her stomach turn. She had heard the word curse whispered in the general store, seen the way Widow Patterson made the sign against evil when their paths crossed at the post office. Willa stood in her empty house that evening, surrounded by the furniture Samuel had chosen and the life they had planned, and felt the loneliness settle into her bones like an old ache. She was young, she was healthy, and she was utterly alone. The bakery kept her hands busy and her bills paid, but it could not keep her warm at night or ease the hollow feeling that had taken up residence in her chest. 3 weeks after Samuel's funeral, Willa was closing up the bakery when she heard the commotion outside. A group of cowboys had ridden into town, their horses kicking up clouds of red dust in the late afternoon sun. Jerome sat perched on Cleopatra Hill, overlooking the Verde Valley, and strangers passing through were common enough. But something about the way people were talking made her pause at the window. The man who swung down from his horse moved with an easy confidence that seemed to command attention without demanding it. He was tall, with dark hair that curled at his collar and shoulders broad enough to fill out his worn leather vest. Even from a distance, Willa could see the way he smiled at something one of his companions said, the flash of white teeth against sun-bronzed skin. She watched him tie his horse outside the saloon and disappear inside, then shook her head at her own foolishness. The last thing she needed was to notice any man, cursed as she apparently was, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. The next morning, that same cowboy walked into her bakery just as she was pulling fresh bread from the oven. The heat from the brick oven had turned her cheeks pink and loosened the strands of honey-colored hair from her bun. She looked up, flour dusting her apron, and found herself staring into the bluest eyes she had ever seen. "Morning, madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal that tangle of dark hair. "Heard tell you make the best sourdough between here and Prescott." Willa wiped her hands on her apron, trying to ignore the way her heart had suddenly decided to beat faster. "I do not know about that, but the bread is fresh if you want some." "I will take 2 loaves," he said, then extended his hand. "Name is Vincent Orley. Most folks call me Vince." She hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. His grip was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who knew hard work. Willa Zimmerman. She saw it then, the slight flicker in his eyes. Recognition. He had heard about her. But instead of making excuses and backing toward the door like she expected, he simply smiled. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Zimmerman. That bread smells like heaven itself." Willa wrapped his loaves in brown paper, acutely aware of his eyes on her as she worked. Are you passing through Jerome or staying a while? Depends, Vince said, leaning against the counter in a way that seemed natural rather than forward. I have been working cattle drives for the past 5 years, saving up to buy my own ranch. Heard there might be some good land around the Verde Valley worth looking at. There is land, Willa agreed, tying the string around his package. Though most folks around here are more interested in what is under the ground than on top of it. Copper, Vince nodded. I know. But I am a cattleman, not a miner. Give me open sky and honest work any day. He paused, then added carefully, I also heard you have had some hard times recently. I am sorry for your losses. Willa's hand stilled on the counter. She waited for the platitudes, the barely concealed fear, the hasty retreat. Instead, Vince just looked at her with something that might have been understanding. Thank you, she said quietly. My mother died when I was 12, Vince said, his voice gentle. Fever took her, same as it took my baby sister. My father could not look at me for months afterward without seeing what he had lost. Grief makes people strange sometimes, makes them look for reasons and blame where there is none to be found. Willa felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. The town thinks I am cursed. The town thinks a lot of things, Vince said, does not make them true. He picked up his bread and placed coins on the counter. I will be back for more of this come Friday if that is all right with you. The bakery is open, Willa said, and found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. True to his word, Vince returned on Friday, and then again on Monday. By the end of the week, Willa had started to expect the sound of his boots on her wooden floor, the way he would lean against the counter and tell her stories about life on the trail. He spoke of nights under endless stars, of rivers crossed and storms weathered, of the bone-deep satisfaction of honest exhaustion. He made her laugh with tales of stubborn cattle and ornery horses, and he listened when she talked about her dreams of expanding the bakery, maybe adding a small cafe. Why do you keep coming here? Willa asked one morning, unable to help herself. People talk. They will think you are courting the cursed widow. Vince looked at her steadily. Let them think what they want. I am buying bread from a talented baker who happens to be good company. Nothing cursed about that. But it was more than bread, and they both knew it. By the 3rd week, Vince had taken to arriving early enough to help her carry flour sacks from the storage room. He fixed the hinge on her oven door that had been sticking for months. And when Martha Henderson came in one day and deliberately turned her back on Willa in a pointed snub, Vince tipped his hat to Willa and bid her good morning so warmly that the older woman's cheeks flushed with shame. You did not have to do that, Willa said after Martha left. Do what? Vince asked innocently. Be polite to the woman who makes the best cinnamon rolls I have ever tasted. Willa laughed despite herself. I have not made cinnamon rolls in weeks. Well then, Vince said, his blue eyes twinkling, I guess I will just have to keep coming back until you do. The walls Willa had built around her heart were beginning to crack, and it terrified her. She lay awake at night, remembering the warmth in Vince's voice, the way he looked at her like she was something precious rather than something to be feared. But fear came with the hope. What if the town was right? What if there was something wrong with her, some darkness that claimed any man who dared to care for her? She tried to push him away. When he came in on Thursday, she was cold and distant, keeping the counter between them like a barricade. Vince accepted his bread without comment, but his eyes were sad. Did I do something to offend you? He asked quietly. No, Willa said, not meeting his gaze. I just think maybe you should find another bakery. There is no other bakery in Jerome, Vince pointed out. But that is not really what this is about, is it? Willa's hands clenched in her apron. People are talking about us. I do not care. You should. She finally looked up at him and was startled by the intensity in his expression. 2 men have died after marrying me, Vince. 2 good men who deserved better than what they got. I will not be responsible for a third. Vince set down his package and came around the counter before Willa could protest. He did not touch her, but he stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow. "You listen to me, Willa Zimmerman," he said, his voice low and fierce. "You are not responsible for an act of God or a mining accident. You are not cursed and you are not dangerous. You are a woman who has survived more grief than most people face in a lifetime, and you are still standing. That does not make you cursed. That makes you strong." "You do not know that," Willa whispered. "You do not know what might happen." "You are right," Vince agreed. "None of us knows what tomorrow brings. I could get thrown from my horse today. You could have a runaway wagon hit the bakery. A man could spend his whole life playing it safe and still die in his sleep. That is just life, Willa. It is not a curse. It is not your fault, and I will be damned if I let you push away something good because you are afraid of something that might never happen." Tears sprang to Willa's eyes. "I could not bear it if something happened to you." "Then we agree on something," Vince said softly. "Because I could not bear it either. But I would rather take that risk than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." He paused, then added with a small smile, "Besides, I have heard that third time is the charm." Willa laughed through her tears, a sound somewhere between a sob and genuine amusement. "That is a terrible thing to say." "Maybe," Vince admitted, "but it made you smile, and I happen to think your smile is worth quite a lot." From that day forward, something shifted between them. Vince began escorting Willa to church on Sundays, his presence at her side a silent declaration that he did not care what the town thought. At first, people stared. Widow Patterson actually gasped audibly when she saw them walking together. But Vince just tipped his hat to everyone they passed, his hand warm and steady at the small of Willa's back, and gradually the stares began to lose their edge. Vince found the land he was looking for, a stretch of valley grassland about 5 miles from Jerome with a creek running through it and views that stretched forever. He took Willa to see it on a Sunday afternoon, riding out in a borrowed buggy, because she admitted she had never learned to ride properly. "This is beautiful," Willa breathed, standing at the edge of the property and looking out over the rolling hills dotted with juniper and mesquite. "You could build something wonderful here." "I hope to," Vince said. He moved to stand behind her close enough that she could feel his warmth but not quite touching. "I have been thinking about what kind of house to build, something solid, meant to last, big enough for a family." Willa's heart stuttered. "Vince." "I know we have not been courting long," Vince said, "and I know you are scared, but Willa, I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I am in love with you. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you hum while you knead bread. I love how you remember that old Bill Thompson likes his sourdough sliced thick, and how you slip extra rolls to the Henderson children even though their mother treats you poorly. I love you, and I want to build a life with you. Here, on this land, if you will have me." Willa turned to face him, her eyes searching his. What she saw there took her breath away. It was not the tentative affection she had known with Thomas, or the comfortable companionship she had shared with Samuel. This was something fiercer, something that burned bright and steady in Vince's blue eyes. This was a man who had looked at her shadows and chosen to stay. "I am afraid," she admitted. "I know," Vince said, "but fear is not a reason to stop living. It is not a reason to turn away from something real. What if the town is right? What if I really am cursed?" Vince took her hands in his. "Then I guess you are stuck with a very stubborn cowboy who does not believe in curses." "Willa, I have faced down stampedes and rustlers and winters cold enough to freeze a man's bones. I am not afraid of small-minded gossip or bad luck. The only thing I am afraid of is losing you without ever having tried." Willa felt the last of her resistance crumble. "I love you too," she whispered. "God help me, I do." Vince's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He cupped her face in his calloused hands and kissed her with a gentleness that made her knees weak. It was a kiss that tasted of hope and promise, of new beginnings and second chances. When they finally broke apart, Willa was breathless and blushing and happier than she had been in years. "Marry me," Vince said. It was not quite a question, more like a fervent plea. "I know it is fast, and I know people will talk. But I am 30 years old, Willa, and I have never felt this way about anyone. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you are not cursed. You are blessed." "Yes," Willa said, and then laughed at the look of pure joy that crossed his face. "Yes, I will marry you, Vincent Orley. But we are going to take our time and do this properly. No rushing to the altar while the town is still gossiping." "How long?" Vince asked, looking like he wanted to argue. 6 months, Willa said firmly. "Let people see that you are healthy and happy. Let them see that there is no curse. And give me time to get used to the idea that this is real." Vince looked like he wanted to protest, but something in her expression must have convinced him. 6 months, he agreed. "But I am courting you properly during that time. Flowers and dinners and everything you deserve." True to his word, Vince courted her with an enthusiasm that was both charming and slightly overwhelming. He brought her wildflowers picked from his new land. He took her to dances and church socials, holding her close and glaring at anyone who dared to whisper. He helped her at the bakery, rising before dawn to fire up the ovens and knead dough alongside her. And slowly, gradually, the town's attitude began to shift. It helped that Vince was well liked. He was friendly with everyone, quick to help a neighbor in need, and had a way of diffusing tension with a joke or a kind word. He became a regular at the saloon, not for the drinking but for the camaraderie, and the men there came to respect him. When someone made a comment about Willa's supposed curse, Vince shut it down with a calm firmness that brooked no argument. "Willa Zimmerman is going to be my wife," he said one evening, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "And I will not tolerate anyone speaking ill of her. She has suffered losses, same as many of us have. That does not make her cursed. That makes her human. And any man who cannot see that is a fool." The silence that followed was heavy, but then old Pete Martin, who had lost his own wife to fever years before, raised his glass. "To Willa," he said. "And to the man smart enough to see past a bunch of superstitious nonsense." Other glasses were raised, and the tension broke. After that night, the worst of the gossip faded. People were still cautious, still watching, but the open hostility was gone. Willa began to hope that maybe, just maybe, she and Vince could have a real chance. The 6 months passed in a blur of happiness that Willa had almost forgotten was possible. Vince broke ground on his house, working from dawn to dusk to raise the walls and frame before winter came. Willa spent her free time helping him, learning to handle a hammer and paintbrush, laughing at his terrible jokes and falling more deeply in love with every passing day. They talked about everything. Vince told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the father who had taught him to work hard and treat people fairly. Willa shared memories of her mother's patient hands teaching her to bake, of Thomas's shy courtship and Samuel's steady kindness. It hurt to speak of them, but Vince never flinched from her grief. He held her hand and listened, and somehow that made the pain a little easier to bear. "I used to feel guilty," Willa admitted one evening as they sat on the porch of his half-finished house, watching the sun set over the valley. "For being happy again, like I was betraying their memory." "You are not betraying anyone," Vince said, his arm around her shoulders. Love does not work that way. You can honor what you had with them and still build something new with me. They would want you to be happy, Willa. I think they would have liked you, Willa said softly. Thomas would have appreciated your work ethic. Samuel would have enjoyed your stories. I wish I could have known them, Vince said, and meant it. They were part of making you who you are. I cannot regret that. November brought cooler weather and the approach of their wedding day. The house was finished enough to be livable, with a bedroom and a kitchen, and a large front room with windows that looked out over the land Vince was already filling with cattle. Willa had sold her house in town, using the money to expand the bakery and hire a young woman named Sarah to help with the daily work. She would still bake, but now she would not be tied to the shop dawn to dusk. The week before the wedding, Willa was working at the bakery when Martha Henderson came in. The older woman stood awkwardly by the door for a moment before approaching the counter. "Mrs. Zimmerman," she said, not quite meeting Willa's eyes, "I owe you an apology. I have been cruel and unfair, and I am ashamed of how I have treated you." Willa stared at her in surprise. "Mrs. Henderson, please, let me finish," Martha said, her voice tight with emotion. "I lost my husband 15 years ago to a mining accident. I was angry and hurt, and when you lost Thomas too, I suppose some part of me was relieved that I was not alone in my grief. But when you remarried, when you found happiness with Samuel, I was jealous. And when he died too, I let that jealousy turn into something ugly. I told myself you were cursed because it was easier than admitting I was just bitter." She finally looked up, and there were tears in her eyes. "You deserved better from me, from all of us, and I hope you can forgive me." Willa felt her own eyes sting with tears. "Of course I forgive you. We've all been hurt, Mrs. Henderson. Grief makes us do things we are not proud of." Martha nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "That man of yours is a good one. He came to my house last week and read me the riot act about how I had treated you. But he was kind about it, if you can believe that, made me see what a fool I had been." She managed a watery smile. "You hold on to him, Mrs. Zimmerman, and do not you dare let anyone make you feel cursed again. You deserve happiness." After Martha left, Willa sank into a chair and cried tears of relief and release. She had not realized how much she had needed that apology, that acknowledgement that she was not some harbinger of death, but simply a woman who had suffered loss. When Vince came by later, she told him what had happened, and he held her close. "I might have had a few words with some of the townspeople," he admitted, "just to make sure everyone understood that my future wife deserves respect." "You did not have to do that," Willa said, but she was smiling. "Yes, I did," Vince said firmly. "You are going to be my partner, Willa, my wife, the mother of my children if God wills it. I will not have anyone making you feel less than the amazing woman you are." Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, the Arizona sky a brilliant blue that seemed to stretch on forever. Willa wore a dress of cream-colored silk, simple but elegant, with her mother's cameo at her throat. She stood in the small church where she had buried 2 husbands and felt no fear. Only hope. Vince waited at the altar in a new suit, his dark hair slicked back, his blue eyes bright with emotion as he watched her walk down the aisle. There was no one to give her away, so Willa walked alone, her head held high. The church was full. Not just because people wanted to gawk, but because in the past 6 months, Vince and Willa had become part of the community again. People had seen their love, their commitment, their simple daily kindness to one another, and even the most stubborn hearts had begun to soften. When Willa reached the altar, Vince took her hands and smiled so widely that she could not help but smile back. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, and Willa felt the last of her fear melt away. This was right. This was real, and whatever happened, they would face it together. I, Vincent Orley, take you, Willa Zimmerman, to be my lawfully wedded wife, Vince said, his voice steady and sure. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Willa repeated her own vows, her voice thick with emotion but clear. I, Willa Zimmerman, take you, Vincent Orley, to be my lawfully wedded husband. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Vince kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart swell. The congregation erupted in applause, and for the first time in 2 years, Willa felt truly home. The reception was held at the saloon, which had been decorated with ribbons and wildflowers. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and more genuine warmth than Willa had felt in years. Old Pete Martin toasted their happiness. Martha Henderson gave Willa a beautiful quilt she had made. Even Widow Patterson managed a stiff but sincere congratulations. As the evening wore on and the stars began to appear, Vince swept Willa into a waltz. She was not the best dancer, but it did not matter. All that mattered was the feel of his arms around her, the steadiness of his heartbeat against her cheek, the absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. "Happy, Mrs. Orley," Vince murmured against her hair. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," Willa admitted. "Vince, about what you said before about children." He pulled back slightly to look at her, hope and caution mingling in his expression. "We do not have to talk about that now if you are not ready." "I am ready," Willa said. "I am ready for all of it. The life, the house, the family. I am ready to stop being afraid and start living again." Vince's kiss was answer enough. They left the reception as the moon rose high over the mountains, riding out to their new home in a wagon decorated with tin cans and ribbons. The house welcomed them with the warm glow of lamplight in the windows, courtesy of Vince's preparations earlier that day. He carried her over the threshold with exaggerated ceremony that made her laugh, and then they were alone in the home they would build together. That first night as husband and wife was tender and sweet, full of whispered words and gentle touches, of learning and exploration, and the deep satisfaction of finally belonging to one another. Willa fell asleep in Vince's arms, feeling safer and more cherished than she had in years. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe the curse had only ever been in her mind. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Willa's life. She divided her time between the bakery and the ranch, learning the rhythms of ranch life alongside the familiar routines of baking. Vince was teaching her to ride, patient and encouraging as she gradually gained confidence. In turn, she taught him to cook more than just basic trail fare, and they spent many evenings in their kitchen, laughing over his attempts at biscuits and celebrating when he finally mastered her mother's stew recipe. The ranch was growing. Vince had a good eye for cattle and a better head for business. He hired 2 hands to help with the daily work, young men who were respectful to Willa and loyal to Vince. The cattle thrived on the valley grass, and Vince began making plans to expand his herd. Willa watched him work with pride, seeing in him the same dedication and integrity that had first drawn her to him. Winter came and went, and with spring came news that made Willa's heart race with joy and terror in equal measure. She was expecting a baby. When she told Vince, he picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, his face alight with joy. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, like he could not quite believe it. "Willa, we are going to be parents." "I am scared," Willa admitted later when the initial excitement had faded. They were lying in bed, Vince's hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "What if something goes wrong? What if there is no curse, Vince said firmly, and nothing is going to go wrong. We are going to have a healthy baby, and you are going to be a wonderful mother, and I am going to do my best not to completely mess up being a father. You are going to be a great father, Willa said, covering his hand with hers. You are kind and patient and strong. Our baby is lucky to have you. Our baby is lucky to have you, Vince corrected. But I suppose we can agree that our child is blessed on both counts. As Willa's pregnancy progressed, Vince treated her like spun glass, constantly worried that she was doing too much or working too hard. Willa found it both endearing and frustrating, especially when he tried to bar her from the bakery entirely. I am pregnant, not an invalid, she informed him tartly one morning when he suggested she stay home and rest instead of going into town. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, and most of them managed to keep working. Most of them were not my wife, Vince countered, and I just want to make sure you and the baby are safe. We are safe, Willa assured him, softening her tone. But I need to keep living my life, Vince. I need to keep doing the things that make me who I am. I promise I will be careful and I will not overdo it. But please do not try to wrap me in cotton wool. Vince reluctantly agreed, though Willa noticed he found excuses to be in town more often, always stopping by the bakery to check on her. She could not really complain. His protectiveness came from love, and after years of feeling like a pariah, it was nice to be cherished so thoroughly. The baby came in early October, after a long and difficult labor that left Vince pacing the floor like a caged animal while the midwife and doctor attended Willa. When the baby's first cry finally split the air, Vince burst into the room despite the doctor's protests. "Willa," he breathed, going to her side. She was exhausted and pale, her hair soaked with sweat, but she had never looked more beautiful to him. "We have a son," Willa said, her voice weak but filled with joy. The midwife placed the baby in her arms, and Willa looked down at the tiny red face with wonder. "Vince, we have a son." Vince touched the baby's tiny hand, marveling as miniature fingers curled around his own. "He is perfect," he said hoarsely. "You are both perfect." They named him William, after Willa's father, with the middle name Vincent. Little William was a healthy baby with a good set of lungs and his father's dark hair. Vince proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to bring the baby to Willa for feeding, walking the floor with William when he was fussy, changing diapers with a determination that made up for his initial clumsiness. "Look at him," Vince would say, staring at their son with naked adoration. "Look what we made. Willa, he is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Willa had to agree. Watching Vince with their son, seeing the gentleness in his strong hands and the love in his eyes, she fell in love with her husband all over again. This was what she had dreamed of and feared she would never have. A family, a home, a love that felt solid and real and enduring. When William was 6 months old, Willa discovered she was pregnant again. Vince was thrilled, though this time he at least tried to restrain his overprotectiveness. Their daughter, Margaret Rose, arrived the following spring with a minimum of fuss and a head full of blonde hair that marked her as clearly Willa's child. William, now a curious toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to touch her tiny hands and feet. The ranch continued to prosper. Vince's reputation as a fair dealer and quality cattleman spread, and he began supplying beef to mining camps throughout the territory. The money was good, allowing them to expand the house and improve the land. Willa gradually stepped back from the day-to-day running of the bakery, though she still baked for special occasions and helped Sarah with the bookkeeping. Her life was full in ways she had never imagined possible. Jerome's attitude toward her had completely transformed. No longer the cursed widow, she was now Mrs. Orley, the respected wife of a successful rancher. People sought her advice on baking and child-rearing. She was invited to join the church ladies' auxiliary and the town improvement committee. It was everything she had once had and lost, given back to her in unexpected abundance. But the true gift was Vince. Years passed, and his love never wavered. He still brought her wildflowers from the pastures. He still kissed her goodbye every morning and hello every evening. He was a patient teacher to their children, a fair employer to his hands, and a devoted husband who made Willa laugh every single day. When people in town marveled at their happiness, Vince would just shrug and say he was the luckiest man alive. "Third time is the charm," he would add with a wink, making Willa roll her eyes even as she smiled. The years brought their share of challenges. There were droughts that tested the ranch's resources and winters that felt endless. William broke his arm falling from a horse when he was 7, giving Willa heart palpitations and making Vince hover like a nervous hen. Margaret proved to be a willful child who could argue the birds down from the trees, requiring patience and firmness in equal measure. But there was also so much joy. William grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books as much as horses, often found reading in the barn when he was supposed to be doing chores. Margaret inherited her father's stubbornness and her mother's warmth, along with a gift for making friends wherever she went. Watching them grow, seeing them become themselves, filled Willa and Vince with pride and wonder. When William was 10 and Margaret was 8, Willa found herself pregnant once more. She was 34 now, and this pregnancy was harder than the previous 2. But when their second son, James Samuel, arrived healthy and squalling, Willa knew the difficulty had been worth it. They named him for both of her previous husbands, a way of honoring the past while embracing the present. "You think they would approve?" Willa asked Vince one night, holding baby James while their older children slept. "Thomas and Samuel, do you think they would be happy for me?" Vince considered the question seriously. "I think anyone who truly loved you would want you to be happy, and you are happy, are you not?" "Deliriously," Willa confirmed. "Some days I can hardly believe this is my life, that I get to have this, have all of it." "Believe it," Vince said, kissing her forehead. "You deserve every bit of happiness you have found, Willa. You survived loss that would have broken most people. You kept going, kept hoping, kept your heart open even when it would have been easier to close it. That takes courage." "I had help," Willa said, looking up at him with soft eyes. "A stubborn cowboy who refused to believe in curses." "Best decision I ever made," Vince said. "Saying hello to you in that bakery all those years ago. Well, that and telling you that third time is the charm." "You are never going to let me forget that, are you?" Willa asked, but she was smiling. "Not a chance," Vince confirmed. As their children grew, so did the ranch and their place in the community. Vince served on the town council and helped mediate disputes between miners and ranchers. Willa opened a small restaurant in town, partnering with Sarah to create a place where miners and families alike could get a good meal. It became a gathering place, known for excellent food and warm hospitality. William decided he wanted to be a lawyer, of all things, inspired by a circuit judge who came through Jerome when he was 12. Vince supported his son's ambitions, proud that the boy wanted to pursue education. Margaret declared she was going to run the ranch someday, and given her ability to manage both cattle and cowboys by the time she was 14, no one doubted she could do it. James, the baby, seemed content to follow wherever his siblings led, equally happy with books or horses. The years rolled on, marked by the small moments that make a life. Sunday dinners with all 3 children around the table, arguing and laughing in equal measure. Quiet evenings on the porch with Vince, watching the sun set over land they had built together. The first time William came home from school in Prescott, full of stories about his studies. Margaret's face the first time Vince let her lead a cattle drive. James's gap-toothed grin when he lost his first tooth. There were hard times too. Vince's father died, and though they had been estranged for years, it hit Vince harder than he expected. They made the trip to Texas for the funeral, and Vince made his peace with the past. A fire in the south pasture destroyed acres of grassland, requiring months of work to restore. And there was always the specter of Willa's past, the memory of loss that never quite faded, but they faced it all together. When Willa had nightmares about losing Vince, he held her and reminded her that he was here, solid and real. When Vince worried about providing for their growing family, Willa reminded him of how far they had come and how strong they were together. They were partners in the truest sense, each shoring up the other's weaknesses and celebrating the other's strengths. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Vince surprised Willa with a trip to San Francisco. It was the first time either of them had been to a big city, and they spent a week marveling at cable cars and tall buildings, and the endless blue of the ocean. But as wonderful as it was, they were both ready to return home. Home to Jerome, to their ranch, to their children and the life they had built. "I used to dream about escaping," Willa admitted as their train carried them back toward Arizona. "When I was young and felt trapped by the town's judgment. I thought if I could just go somewhere new, somewhere no one knew me, I could be happy." "Are you happy?" Vince asked, though he already knew the answer. "Happier than any dream," Willa said, "because I learned that it was not about the place. It was about finding someone who saw me, really saw me, and chose me anyway. You gave me that, Vince. You gave me permission to be happy again." "You gave yourself that permission," Vince corrected. "I just refused to let you hide from it." By the time William left for university at 18, a full 10 years after James was born, Jerome had changed considerably. The copper mines were booming, bringing prosperity and progress. New buildings lined the streets, and talk of running electricity to the town was becoming more serious. But some things remained constant. Willa's restaurant was still the best place to eat. Vince's cattle were still the finest in the territory, and their love was still the subject of admiration and occasionally gentle teasing. "You two are going to make the rest of us look bad," Pete Martin joked at a town social. He was an old man now, his beard gone completely white, but his eyes still twinkled with humor. "The way you still look at each other after all these years, like newlyweds." "I look at her that way because she is still the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," Vince said matter-of-factly, making Willa blush and swat at his arm. "And I look at him that way because he is still the most stubborn, ridiculous, wonderful man I have ever known," Willa added, smiling up at her husband. It was true. The years had been kind to both of them. Vince's hair had threads of silver now, and there were lines around his eyes from squinting at the sun, but he was still strong and vital. Willa's blonde hair had faded to a softer honey color, and motherhood had rounded her figure, but her smile was still luminous. More than that, they had grown together rather than apart, becoming more themselves and more united with each passing year. Margaret took over more responsibility at the ranch as she grew older, proving to have an even better head for the business than her father. She was 20 now, confident and capable, and there was a young man named Daniel who came calling with encouraging frequency. Vince grumbled about it, but Willa just laughed. "She is old enough to make her own choices," Willa reminded him. "And Daniel is a good man, you said so yourself." "That was before he started courting my daughter," Vince muttered, making Willa laugh harder. James, at 12, was growing like a weed and showed signs of having inherited both his mother's warmth and his father's determination. He was the peacemaker of the family, the one who could calm Margaret's temper and coax William out of his books. Willa saw echoes of both Thomas and Samuel in James sometimes, in his gentle manner and steady presence, and it made her heart ache with bittersweet affection. William wrote regularly from university, his letters full of enthusiasm for his studies and plans for the future. He wanted to return to Arizona to practice law, to help people who might not otherwise have access to justice. Vince read his son's letters with undisguised pride, marveling at how the shy boy who had loved books had become this passionate young man. "We did all right, did we not?" Vince said one evening, after reading William's latest letter aloud to Willa. They were on their porch, as they so often were, watching the day fade into twilight. "We did better than all right," Willa said, leaning against his shoulder. "We built something good, Vince, something that will last." "Third time was the charm," Vince said, and this time Willa did not roll her eyes. She just smiled. As the years continued to pass, bringing both changes and constants, Willa often thought about the woman she had been that day in the cemetery, standing beside her second husband's grave while a town whispered about curses. That woman had been so afraid, so convinced that she was doomed to bring death to anyone who loved her. She had been ready to close her heart forever, to live a half-life defined by fear and loss. But then, a cowboy with blue eyes and stubborn confidence had walked into her bakery and refused to believe in curses. He had seen past her grief to the woman underneath. He had loved her fiercely and patiently, weathering the town's gossip and her own fears with equal determination. And in doing so, he had given her permission to live again, to hope again, to love again. The curse had never been real. It had only been grief and coincidence and the very human need to find explanations for tragedy. But the love, oh, the love was real. It was real in Vince's steady presence and gentle hands. It was real in their children's laughter and arguments. It was real in the ranch they had built and the community they had become part of. It was real in the thousands of small moments that made up a life together. Breakfast conversations and bedtime kisses and everything in between. On their 20th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. William came home from his law practice in Phoenix, where he had recently made partner. Margaret and Daniel, married now for 2 years with a baby daughter of their own, helped organize the festivities. James, now a young man of 17 with plans to study veterinary medicine, gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. "To my parents," James said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love is not about avoiding loss, but about having the courage to choose joy anyway. Who showed us that family is built in the everyday moments as much as the grand gestures, and who still hold hands at the dinner table when they think we are not looking." The laughter that followed was warm and affectionate. Vince and Willa did indeed hold hands, unashamed of the sentiment. Later, after the guests had departed and the children had retired to their various rooms, Vince and Willa sat on their porch once more. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any city lights, stretching on forever in the vast Arizona sky. 20 years, Willa mused. "It does not feel that long." "Best 20 years of my life," Vince said. "Well, the best 26 if you count the time I spent courting you and convincing you I was not going to drop dead." "I cannot believe you still joke about that," Willa said, but she was smiling. "I joke about it because it is not true," Vince said. "It never was. You were never cursed, Willa. You were just a woman who had suffered loss, and you deserved someone who could see that. I am glad I was stubborn enough to stick around." "I am glad you were stubborn too," Willa said softly. "I am glad you did not give up on me, even when I tried to push you away. I am glad you believed in third times and charms and all those silly sayings that turned out to be true." Vince pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Somewhere a coyote called. Cattle lowed softly in the distance. The wind rustled through the cottonwoods Vince had planted when they first built the house, now tall and strong. "What are you thinking about?" Vince asked after a while. "Everything," Willa said. "How scared I was the day we met. How certain I was that loving you would lead to disaster. How grateful I am that I was wrong. This life we have built, Vince, this family, this home, it is everything I thought I had lost forever. Everything I was afraid to even want, and you gave it to me." "We gave it to each other," Vince corrected. "I needed you as much as you needed me, Willa. You taught me that love does not have to be complicated or dramatic, that it can be simple and steady and still be the most important thing in your life. You taught me what it means to be a husband, a father, a partner. Everything good in my life came from you." They kissed then, a kiss that held 20 years of love and partnership, of challenges overcome and joys shared. It was not the desperate passion of new love or the tentative affection of uncertain courtship. It was something deeper and more enduring, the kiss of two people who had built a life together and intended to keep building it for as long as they had breath. The years continued their steady march. Margaret and Daniel took over most of the ranch operations, allowing Vince to slow down a bit, though he would never truly retire. James completed his education and opened a veterinary practice in Jerome, quickly becoming indispensable to ranchers throughout the area. William married a lovely young woman named Catherine and gave Vince and Willa their first grandson. Willa finally sold the restaurant, ready to spend her time with grandchildren and the garden she had always meant to cultivate. Vince taught their grandchildren to ride, just as he had taught their children. And together, they watched their family grow and flourish, taking pride in knowing they had created something that would outlast them. On quiet evenings, they still sat on their porch, holding hands and watching the sun set over the land they loved. Sometimes they talked about the past, remembering both the joys and sorrows that had brought them to this moment. Sometimes they talked about the future, making plans and dreaming dreams. And sometimes they just sat in silence, needing no words to communicate the depth of their love and contentment. The town of Jerome had long since forgotten about curses and whispered gossip. Willa and Vince Orley were pillars of the community, respected and admired for their kindness, integrity, and devotion to one another. Their love story had become something of a local legend, told to young couples as an example of what was possible when you had courage and faith. When asked about their secret, Vince always gave the same answer. "There is no secret. You just have to show up every day and choose to love each other, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard, and you have to believe that love is stronger than fear." Willa would add with a smile, "And it helps to have a stubborn cowboy who refuses to believe in curses." As they grew older, their love only deepened. Vince's hair went completely silver and his back ached on cold mornings, but he still reached for Willa first thing every day. Willa's hands developed arthritis that made baking difficult, but she still insisted on making Vince's favorite biscuits every Sunday. They moved a little slower, tired a little easier, but the spark between them never dimmed. Their children and grandchildren marveled at it, the way Vince still lit up when Willa entered a room, the way Willa still blushed when Vince complimented her. It was a love that had weathered decades and emerged not just intact but stronger. A love built on friendship and respect as much as passion. A love that had proven, beyond any doubt, that third times could indeed be the charm. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the family gathered once more for a celebration. There were 12 grandchildren now, ranging from infants to teenagers, and the house rang with their laughter and chaos. Willa looked around at the crowd of loved ones, at the children and grandchildren who existed because a stubborn cowboy had once walked into her bakery and refused to believe in curses, and felt her heart swell with gratitude. "What are you thinking?" Vince asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I am thinking that I am the luckiest woman alive," Willa said, leaning back against him. "I am thinking about how close I came to refusing you, to letting fear win. And I am thinking about how grateful I am that you would not let me." "I am pretty stubborn," Vince agreed, his breath warm against her ear. "You are impossible," Willa corrected, turning in his arms to face him. "And I love you more than words can say." "Good," Vince said, kissing her softly. "Because I plan on spending many more years annoying you with my stubbornness." And he did. They had many more years together, watching their family continue to grow and their love continue to deepen. They faced the challenges of aging with the same partnership that had defined their marriage, supporting each other through illness and loss, celebrating each other through triumphs and joys. When Vince died at 73, peacefully in his sleep after a full and happy life, Willa mourned him deeply. But it was not the desperate, frightened grief she had felt with Thomas and Samuel. This was the clean grief of having loved fully and been loved completely in return. She missed him terribly, ached for his presence every single day, but she was not broken by his loss. Because Vince had spent their entire marriage teaching her that she was not cursed, that love was worth the risk, that joy could coexist with sorrow. She lived another 5 years after Vince passed, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who all bore witness to the love their grandparents had shared. She told them stories about the stubborn cowboy who had walked into her bakery and changed her life. She told them about the town that had called her cursed and the man who had taught her to believe in blessings instead. And when Willa finally joined Vince, slipping away quietly in the house they had built together, it was with a smile on her face and his name on her lips. She had lived a full life, a happy life, a life that proved beyond any doubt that third times could be the charm. That love could heal old wounds and create new joy. That courage and faith and stubborn determination could overcome even the darkest fears. In Jerome, Arizona, where the copper mines had long since closed and new generations had come and gone, people still told the story of Willa Zimmerman and Vincent Orley. They told it to young couples who were facing their own fears and doubts. They told it as a reminder that love, real love, was worth fighting for. That sometimes the greatest courage was simply refusing to give up on happiness, even when the whole world said you should. The ranch still stood, run now by great-grandchildren who had never known Vince and Willa, but who carried their legacy forward. The house was full again with the laughter of children. The land was still worked with love and respect. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Verde Valley, it was easy to imagine an older couple sitting on the porch, holding hands and watching the day fade into twilight. They had built something that lasted, not just a ranch or a family, but a love story that endured long after they were gone. A story that began with a curse that was not real and ended with a blessing that was. A story that proved, once and for all, that third time truly could be the charm. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy of all. Not the land or the cattle or even the children they had raised, but the proof, written in every day of their 35 years together, that love could conquer fear, that hope could outlast grief, and that sometimes when you were brave enough to take a chance on happiness, magic happened. Willa had been wrong about the curse. There had never been one, except the one she had placed on herself through fear and guilt. But she had been right about one thing. Third time was the charm. Not because the third time was magically different, but because she had finally been ready to believe in possibilities instead of probabilities, in hope instead of fear, in love instead of loss. And Vince had been right too. About stubborn cowboys and beautiful bakers, and the power of refusing to give up on someone you loved. He had walked into her bakery that morning 26 years before their death, seen a woman the town called cursed, and decided she was worth fighting for. And in that simple act of defiance against fear and superstition, he had changed both their lives forever. Their story became legend in Jerome, passed down through generations like a treasured heirloom. Young women facing their own struggles would hear about Willa and take courage. Young men learning about love would hear about Vince and understand what it meant to truly see another person. And the town that had once whispered about curses learned to speak instead about blessings, about second chances, about the transformative power of love that refused to quit. In the graveyard where Willa had once stood beside her second husband's grave, feeling cursed and alone, there now stood a monument to a different kind of love. The stone was simple but elegant, marking the final resting place of Vincent and Willa Orley. The inscription read simply, "Third time was the charm, together forever." And it was true, every word of it. Because sometimes, in the wild and beautiful landscape of the American West, in the dusty mining towns and sprawling ranches, in the hearts of stubborn cowboys and brave women, magic happened. Not the magic of fairy tales or superstition, but the real magic of human connection, of choosing love over fear, of building something beautiful out of the raw materials of grief and hope. Willa and Vince had proven that. They had taken a story that began with tragedy and transformed it into something triumphant. They had faced down gossip and fear and their own doubts, and they had won. Not because they were perfect or lucky or blessed by some external force, but because they chose each other every single day, and they refused to let anything, not even death itself, diminish the love they had built together. That was their legacy. That was their gift to the family they created and the town they called home. The knowledge that love, real and enduring love, was always worth the risk. That third times could be the charm if you were brave enough to try. And that sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply opening your heart one more time, even when you were terrified of what might happen. In the end, Willa Zimmerman Orley had not been cursed. She had been blessed beyond measure. Blessed with a love that had healed her wounds and given her joy beyond imagining. Blessed with a partner who had seen her at her lowest and loved her at her highest. Blessed with a family that would carry their story forward, generation after generation, as proof that happy endings were possible, even after the darkest beginnings. And somewhere, in the vast Arizona sky above Jerome, two souls rested together, their love story complete but never truly ending. Because love like theirs did not die. It lived on in the children they had raised, the land they had tended, the community they had served, and the hearts of everyone who heard their story and dared to believe that they too could find their third-time charm. The curse had been broken not by magic or luck, but by the simple, stubborn, beautiful act of choosing love. And in that choice, Willa and Vince had found everything they had ever wanted and more than they had ever dreamed possible. They had found home. They had found family. They had found forever. And that, in the end, was the greatest charm of all.